which issued from the Paris Press in 1863. The author of that book, not troubling with any speculations respecting the share with which the apostles may have had in delineated the gospel portraits, but following his own self-imposed theories about miracles and revelations, has displayed boundless recklessness and given way to the most unbridled fantasies respecting the gospel history, caricaturing both it and its hero. He has written a book which has much more the character of a shameless calumny of Jesus than of an honest investigation into his career. Can we apply the terms historical inquiry to an attempt to show that John wrote the fourth gospel out of a spirit of self-love, not without jealousy of Peter and full of hatred to Judas Iscariot? Can we dignify by so high a term as scientific investigation such a theory as is respected the cause of sympathy felt for Jesus by the wife of Pilate, that she saw the Gentile Galilean, the fine-looking young man, from a window of the palace that looked out in the temple court, that in consequence the thought that blood was to be spilled rested like a mountain load upon her soul? To cite one or two more examples of this mode of dealing with the Gospels, what shall we say of his manner of treating raising of Lazarus, where he endeavours to show that Jesus, whose role was becoming more and more difficult every day, practiced an involuntary piece of deception? End of quote. A bit there. What I want to say here, what Tischendorf is doing is he's just taking on various scholars of his time. But what is very interesting, which modern scholars today often don't tell you, is the evangelical scholars of the 19th century were dealing with these textual critical issues in a very scientific way, trying to do it in an objective way. And what is not often remembered or noted is the more esoteric, creative scholarship, the Strausses, the Reynolds, were people who did not base their scholarship on as a scientific foundation, as people like Tischendorf. And so Tischendorf is absolutely demolishing his opponents by sticking to good methodology, trying to keep us objective to the evidence of the facts, rather than presenting theories that are creative but not based in any reality of fact. And that's what you see from the 19th century onwards to the 20th century. Modern textual critics and modern New Testament scholars come into the subject with creative theories that have very little evidence and the ignoring of a vast weight of evidence. And no matter how objective you come, it was impossible to break this noose that these kind of scholars have got. However, things are changing today in the academic world. But the point is this, that people like Tischendorf and Bishop Lightfoot and many others had to fight tooth and nail to try and be sober scholars and critique the more popular scholarship that was trying to win over the people's thinking, but was not actually based in any decent scholarship whatsoever. And we have to blame the German scholars for that, for being too esoteric. And so we're going to jump a few pages now, because he goes into Renan and he goes into a few other scholars, and we'll get into some of the meat. It seems to me, he says, that this duty has been by no means faithfully enough met for the first three so-called synoptic gospels, and still less for that of John, whose want of authenticity has been inscribed in flaming letters upon the banners of the negative school. The writer of these lines imposes upon himself the task of trying to throw some light upon the evangelical documents, although in preparing the work not as special students but cultivated Christians generally, it may not be possible to enter so exhaustively into the subject as under the circumstances might be desirable. We can make as our starting point the unquestioned fact that in the last decade of the 2nd century our four Gospels were known and acknowledged in all portions of the Church. Here we get into some meat now. Irenaeus from 177 on, Bishop of Lyons, where the first Christian Church of Gaul was established, wrote a great work in the last decades of the 2nd century, directed the earlier heresies, the Gnostic, and on every page made use of the Gospels. Now this fact, this is me now, not Tischendorf, this fact alone is absolutely devastating to people like Bart Ehrman and modern textual critics and modern conspiracy theories about the New Testament. End of quote. That was just, let's get back to Tischendorf. Irenaeus on every page made use of the gospel, providing himself from them with material to overthrow a system which was threatening to destroy the doctrines of the church. The number of passages where he has recourse to the Gospels is about 400, and about 80 of these contain quotations from the Gospel of John. I mean, to me, this is me again, to me this is absolutely devastating to any critic of the New Testament. Because what it tells you is the four Gospels were early historical material. When you compare this historical material to, say, the life of Caesar or to the life of Cleopatra or whatever, this is astounding, because it's telling you that these sources go back early on. Now, one perceptive atheist said, what do you mean by early? Well, early can mean within 50 years of the event. It can mean 100 years of the event. Whether it be 50 years or 100, it's still compared in the ancient history and ancient literature. It's vastly superior to any ancient literature when it comes to historical information. He says, from the closing decades of the 2nd century on, the able and learned Tertullian lived and labored at Carthage in Africa, and in his numerous writings there exist hundreds of citations from the text of the Gospels. Again, this is me, devastating to Bart Ehrman and modern scholars today who would attack the veracity of the New Testament, which, back to Tischendorf, which he made use of as his most decisive authorities. The same is true of Clemens and the celebrated teacher in the school of the Catacombs at Alexandria about the end of the 2nd century. Nor must I fail to allude to a catalogue generally known by the name of its discoverer, the ancient scholar Muratori, of all the books which were regarded as canonical in the very earliest times. This work was probably prepared at Rome, and shortly after the time of the Roman Bishop Pius II. Some were between 160 to 170 AD. In this catalogue of books, thus reckoned as comprising the New Testament, the four Gospels are at the head. It is true the first few lines, which relate to Matthew and Mark, have been lost, but at the close of the still extant words respecting the later, the Gospel of Luke is spoken of as the third, and that of John as the fourth, enabling us to see that even in the very earliest days the order was followed with which we are so familiar. I have thus summoned the witness from Gaul, from Proconsular Africa, the present Algiers, from Alexandria, and from Rome. Two others can be cited for fitly here, although one of them goes back to the remoter date. End of Tischendorf. I'll carry on in a minute. Here's an important point that the textual critics, Bart Ehrman, and many scholars fail to see, and the critics. Notice that Tischendorf is showing that we have a bishop from Gaul, a leader from Africa, a leader from Alexandria, and from Rome. Different parts of the ancient world believing in the Gospels as written by the writers who wrote them. That is a highly significant fact. What that tells you, if that's happening in the 2nd century, what that clearly tells you, and skeptics do not fathom this out, and you need to understand that if the gospel has spread in the 2nd century so wide and was so well known in the 2nd century, it clearly shows you that these are going back to the 1st century. And not only going back to the 1st century, but they are intricately connected to the historical. Here's a quote. Here's a very important point. The historical oral tradition of the Gospels. Now, notice I didn't say oral tradition. I said historical tradition. Very important distinction there. James Dunn has made that distinction, and it's a very important distinction. Because in the ancient church, in the gospel, writers of the Gospels, there were two types of oral tradition. Just a parenthesis, oral tradition, you have to look at it in it's culturally specific. That's another issue that a lot of skeptics fail to realize. Each culture has a different aspect, a different way of passing on its oral traditions, and so they are culturally specific. And within the time of the Gospels, there were two types of oral tradition, the one where you passed it on by mouth, and what we would call historical oral tradition. That is, individual people who were seen as important in collecting the historical information of the past and passing it on, either by writing or by verbal passing it on. So what the whole point is that what Tischendorf has noted here, which is very important, is that the Gospels were already well known in the 2nd century in Gaul, Africa, Alexandria, and Rome, which tells you they are 1st century documents, which tells you that they have been carefully preserved coming from historical oral tradition. Okay, let's get back to Tischendorf. If you want more information on that, go and listen to James Dunn's lectures on oral tradition.